All right, so today we'll go ahead and uh, get into the basic overview of thermoregulation. So, how exactly the body maintains temperature both at rest and during exercise. Now, first of all, humans are homeotherms, which just simply means that we are warm blooded. We maintain a relatively constant internal body temperature regardless on what's going on outside, right? So if we are uh, seeing weather that's negative 40 degrees wind chill, we are still going to have a core temperature of approximately 98.6. And then if we are at 100 degrees uh, Fahrenheit uh, in the summer, we are still going to see a core temperature of approximately 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. And that's really the whole point of thermoregulation. So heat loss must continuously match heat gain. And so our normal core temperature hovers around 37 degrees Celsius, which is roughly 98.5 degrees Fahrenheit. And if you ever need to convert Celsius to Fahrenheit, because we are one of three countries that like to be difficult, uh, we would take the Celsius temperature, multiply by 1.8, add 32. So you take 37, multiply it by 1.8, you're going to get 66. And then you take that 66.6 and add 32, you get 98.6. Now, core temperature control is going to be absolutely critical because cellular structures and metabolic pathways depend on a very narrow temperature range. So, if that core temperature rises above 45 degrees Celsius, we see proteins and enzymes begin to break down, and at that point, ATP production becomes impaired, and the body is on a fast track toward cell death, and which would eventually lead to death for us. Now, if the temperature drops below 34 degrees Celsius, we see metabolic processes slow down dramatically, and the risk of uh, cardiac arrhythmias increase significantly. So basically, we live our entire lives just a few degrees away from temperatures that can kill us, and it's a pretty thin margin. Now, as far as how we regulate temperature, we see because temperature is so tightly linked to enzyme function and metabolic rate and cellular integrity, we have to put, or our body has to put a lot of effort into keeping the core temperature stable. And so to regulate temperature, the body relies on a combination of uh, nervous system and hormonal mechanisms. So you have the hypothalamus, which is the brain's temperature control center. It receives input from thermal receptors in the skin and from changes in the temperature of the blood uh, as the blood is passing through. Now, the body functions more like a furnace than a refrigerator, right? So we constantly produce heat through metabolism, and uh, we only lose a small, steady amount. And we do this because heat generation is far easier for the body than heat dissipation, which is why overheating is often a greater challenge than uh, underheating or becoming too cold. So, to maintain a constant core temperature, heat gain must equal heat loss. And so, if heat gain exceeds heat loss, then our body temperature rises. If heat loss exceeds heat gain, then our body temperature will fall. Now, during exercise, especially vigorous, intense exercise, muscles produce large amounts of metabolic heat. And because of that, our body temperature typically rises above 37 degrees Celsius in most bouts of exercise. And remember, we are producing all this heat during our muscular contractions, right? So we see our bodies actually fairly inefficient. Only about 20-30% of the energy goes to actually contracting the skeletal muscles that we need to move, while the other 70-80% is going to be lost as heat. And so because we see our core body temperature rise in most bouts of exercise, we see that prolonged exercise in hot or humid environments are going to pose a real threat to our health, because heat production skyrockets while the body's ability to get rid of any excess heat becomes limited. Now, during exercise, the body adjusts the heat loss mechanisms to keep the temperature within a safe range. So the circulatory system is going to play a key role here. When the goal is to lose heat, we are going to see blood flow is going to be increased to the skin. So warm blood moves to the surface, allowing heat to then transfer to the environment. When the goal is to retain heat, like right now or yesterday, whenever it was -20, blood flow is going to be reduced to the skin, and the blood instead is redirected back toward the core in order to keep the vital organs warm. And this is possible because blood has a high capacity to store and transport heat. And so it's essentially the body's internal heat shuttle. Now, it is important to note that this is also why frostbite can occur at cold temperatures, when blood is not reaching, say, the surface or out to the distal parts of the extremities. And so we see part of adaptation to cold environments is that we have a more balanced dispersion of blood flow to the skin and the ends of our extremities in cold environments. So if you took someone from the southeast and moved them up here in the winter versus someone who's dealt with winters their whole life, you would see at least for the first few weeks, a significant difference in the blood flow distribution between the two individuals. Now we will go ahead and start looking at how the body temperature varies depending on where it's measured and the tools that we use to assess it, which can partly explain why there could be a slight difference in core body temperature throughout the recent decades. So first, there's always a thermal gradient between the body's core and the skin surface or the shell. So under normal resting conditions, there's an ideal difference of approximately 4 degrees Celsius where the core is warmer than the skin surface, and that gap is what allows us to offload heat efficiently to our environment. So we have our warmer cooler surface, and we are able to transport our heat down that gradient from our warm cool to our surface, and then our surface to the environment around us. But we do see in, say, for extreme cold, this gradient can widen very dramatically and can sometimes, in severe situations, reach about 20 degree Celsius difference. But those large differences are going to be rare and usually only seen in harsh environments. Uh, I guess kind of like last weekend. Uh, but even within the core itself, we still see that temperature isn't perfectly uniform. So different organs and regions run at slightly different temperatures, which is why where we measure is going to be very important. So a rectal temperature won't be identical to an esophageal temperature, and it won't be, and neither, excuse me, will be perfectly reflective of what's happening at the brain. So, which is where our command center is as far as controlling temperature. And so when we look at our deep body temperature sites, we have our primary sites, which we can see temperature can be measured at the rectum, which is going to be one of the most common methods in laboratory testing. It lags a little during rapid temperature changes, but it does give a very reliable estimate of deep core temperature. You also have tympanic temperature, which is taken in the ear. It's useful because the ear canal is close to the brain, and again, that's going to be the command center for thermoregulation. And then you have your esophageal temperature, which is one of the best indicators of true core temperature because it reflects temperature near the heart and the large blood vessels. It is excellent for research, but it's also not always comfortable or practical for field settings. Now, in the applied environments, especially in, say, athletics, we can sometimes use ingestible temperature systems. And basically, what this is a small capsule that the athlete swallows, and it transmits internal temperature as it moves through the GI tract. And this gives us a continuous core temperature data point during practice or during competition without interfering with performance. And then we have our skin temperature, which varies widely and changes quickly based on the environment. And we measure skin temperature using thermistors placed on several different body sites. So typically you have the forehead, the chest, the forearm, the thigh, calf, abdomen, and back. And to get a single value that represents overall skin temperature, we take the average of all of those sites. And that's what you see in the equation on the slide deck. So you add all 7 temperatures up, and then you end up dividing by 7. So the core temperature tells us what's happening in the internal environment, but the skin temperature is going to show us more of how the body is interacting with the external environment. And together, they give us a better understanding of how heat can be gained, stored, or lost. All right, so now we will go ahead and just take a look at how the body actually gains and loses heat. So the thermostat of the body, which is the preoptic anterior hypothalamus, is constantly monitoring temperature. When body temperature increases, it turns on mechanisms that increase heat loss. When temperature drops, it fires up heat producing processes. And so this uh, is a very protective thermostat that reacts very quickly in both directions. So you're not sitting in your apartment and you have it set for 70 and it drops all the way to 60 before it kicks on, and then all of a sudden it's 80 because it won't turn off. Yeah. So heat production we see comes primarily from two sources. You have voluntary and involuntary sources. Your voluntary sources will include things like exercise, because remember, about 70 to 80% of the energy you expend during exercise actually becomes heat. It actually doesn't go towards movement at all. Only 20-30% actually goes to that movement. Like I said, we are very inefficient models. Now, you also have your involuntary heat sources, and this is going to include things like shivering. And we see shivering can actually ramp up heat production significantly. So those little micro contractions, that's what it is. Shivering is just micro contractions of the skeletal muscle, can increase heat production 5 times greater than when we were at rest and not shivering. And then we also have non-shivering thermogenesis, which is driven by hormones like thyroxine and catecholamines. Now, when we look at heat exchange, there are 4 pathways where we exchange heat with our environment. And the first 3 are going to require a temperature gradient between the skin and the environment. And then the 4th one, evaporation, actually works off a vapor pressure gradient. So first one we'll take a look at is radiation. So radiation is the transfer of heat by infrared rays. It is constantly happening, and we see at rest about 60% of your heat loss actually comes from radiation. So the majority of our ability to dissipate heat and transfer it to our environment at rest comes from radiation. And this is because your skin is usually warmer than the surrounding surfaces. So think about how cold the brick walls are right now in the winter, how cold the floor would be. So you radiate heat outward. But radiation can also lead to heat gain. So for instance, on a hot day in the summer, you have the sun beating down on the road, the sidewalks. You have the asphalt, the concrete that are actually hotter than you. You have your direct sun. And so we see these sources radiate heat into the body because we have a temperature gradient where there is a higher temperature from these sources than our body. Now, number 2, we have conduction, which is the heat transfer through direct contact. And so think about this like sitting on a cold metal chair. So your body loses heat into that material because the molecules are touching, and in general, conduction accounts for a small portion of heat loss during daily activities. But as you can tell, like when you sit down on a cold metal cold metal bench, uh, you could potentially start to shiver. You get a cold chill right as uh, we transfer a lot of our heat to that bench. Also, the Palmer cooling uh, tube that we're using, that would be uh, looking at transferring heat through conduction. And then you have convection, which is heat transfer by the movement of air or water across the skin. And so air or water molecules will hit your skin, pick up heat, uh, move away, and get replaced with cooler molecules that will continue that same cycle where they'll hit your skin, pick up heat, and move away, and then be replaced with cooler molecules. So think of a fan blowing across your skin. Right, this is going to increase the number of cool molecules that are hitting you. So convection increases. Water is especially powerful. We see that it's about 25 times more effective at pulling heat away from the body than air. And this is why swimming or getting caught in cold water can cool or freeze or chill the body very quickly. And this is part of the premise with your full body suits when you go, say, wakeboarding. So the full body suits actually don't prevent the water from cooling your body. Instead, what it does is it traps the water in an area or a layer that is close to the body, and thus you have more time in contact with those specific molecules, and thus more time to increase that temperature of the water that is in contact with your skin and layered in the suit. And so what ends up happening is it keeps you warm because your body is able to warm the specific water molecules that are around it. And instead of the water just touching your skin, picking up heat, moving away, and getting replaced with cooler molecules, those full body suits allow you to keep those water molecules around your body longer, and thus heating up the temperature of the water around you and minimizing that temperature gradient, and thus reducing the amount of heat loss that you'll experience. And then lastly, you have evaporation, which is going to be the primary method of heat loss during exercise. It is the most important of the four exchanges or modes of exchange during exercise. And so what we see is that when sweat absorbs enough heat, it turns into vapor and it takes heat away from the body. And so evaporation requires a vapor pressure gradient. So basically, the air must be dry enough to accept the water vapor. And that's a key issue, particularly for athletes where relative humidity is fairly high. So humidity is the biggest environmental factor affecting evaporation. So if you have high humidity, you have low evaporation, and thus you have poor cooling. And then you have low humidity, which will increase the evaporation ability and thus lead to more effective cooling. So sweat doesn't actually cool you down. It's the evaporation of the sweat. And so when you live in dry environments out here, you have a better ability to uh, transfer heat through evaporation. Whereas if you move to, say, Louisiana, where humidity is almost 100, it's like 84 as the average, and you have to cut through the air with a knife, right? We see that this is going to reduce the ability of sweat to evaporate, and as a result, we hit what is referred to as a drip point, and any time sweat starts to drip off of you, we actually don't see any cooling effect at all. And in fact, when it really starts to drip off of you, we actually start to see it uh, have uh, counterintuitive effects where we are actually going to see an increase in body temperature because we can't get the sweat to evaporate fast enough. Now, at rest, we see that about 25% of heat loss is evaporation, but during exercise, it's actually going to become that dominant method, and we see potentially up to 80% of heat loss during exercise comes from evaporation. And so the evaporation rate depends on a variety of factors: temperature and humidity, which is probably the most important. You also have air movement, so your convective currents, and then also how much skin is exposed. So are you covered head to toe in football equipment and you really only have your forearms and calves exposed, versus are you maybe going for a light jog in a tank top and short shorts? All of those will determine how much heat loss can come from evaporation. So when, for instance, you go outside and play in Montana in the summer, you have high temperature but very low humidity, and then you have all these wind gusts, which will greatly improve the evaporation rate. Whereas in the southeast, you have your hot, very humid, like 70-80% humidity all the time. So you have very high humidity, less air movement than you would see out here, where we don't have a lot of trees or anything obstructing the wind. And as a result, we would have a very ineffective evaporation rate in that area. So if you grew up here, you had it much, much easier whenever it came to cooling yourself during exercise. And then shifting into exactly how the body actually regulates temperature, we see the primary effector is going to be the preoptic anterior hypothalamus, which again you can think of as the thermostat for your body. So it's constantly monitoring temperature and tries to keep that core temperature around the set point of 37 degrees Celsius. But unlike the thermostat in your house or apartment, the body has a whole internal network of sensors feeding into it. So the preoptic anterior hypothalamus gets input from temperature sensitive receptors located either on the skin, and these detect external temperature first. You could have temperature sensitive receptors in the spinal cord and within the preoptic anterior hypothalamus itself, which senses changes in core body temperature. And these thermoreceptors detect both heat and cold, and send signals to the hypothalamus, which uh, decides what effector response is required. And so when the body is overheating, for instance, the hypothalamus initiates heat loss mechanisms. Two major ones we will see is going to be uh, the fact that sweat glands are stimulated to produce sweat, and thus evaporation becomes that main avenue of heat loss during exercise. And then you also have cutaneous vasodilation. And the vasomotor control center withdraws the normal vasoconstrictor tone, and as a result, what we see is that the skin blood vessels dilate, and then we see warm blood move to the skin surface, so heat can dissipate more easily and or to the environment. And this combination, so this increase in sweating and this increase in skin blood flow, is how we prevent these dangerous heat-related illnesses caused from significant overheating during exercise. Now, on the flip side, if core temperatures go down and the body senses cooling, the hypothalamus flips the response. And so you will have the skeletal muscle, which is going to have these little micro contractions, and shivering, which increases heat production, like I said, up to 5 times resting levels. And we do see that shivering again is involuntary and extremely metabolically costly, which isn't great if, say, you are an athlete or, say, in the military, right? And you're having to aim whenever it's cold. If you're shivering the whole time, probably not in a good situation as far as, remaining alive. So it is important to look at your non-shivering thermogenesis as well. So we have vasoconstriction that occurs when the body senses cooling. So blood flow in the skin is reduced. The warm blood stays near the core, and heat loss as a result drops fairly significantly. And so the hypothalamus can also trigger hormonal responses. So catecholamines like norepinephrine or epinephrine will increase metabolic heat production. Thyroxine release will increase over longer exposure or chronic exposure, which will eventually raise your baseline metabolic rate. And we also see piloerection occur, or goosebumps, right? So this is very effective in animals with fur. Humans, not so much. But whenever you look at, say, your forearm, and when you get goosebumps, you see that the hair kind of stands up and creates this larger layer of insulation, right, where we can trap heat. And so for humans, because it's just some hair on your arms, you don't get any significant benefit of trapping and storing heat around you. But we see with, like, your dogs, like huskies, for instance, their coats, when they start to puff out a lot, we see that we increase the surface area of where we trap air molecules, and as a result, we're able to warm up the air closer to our core. And so, just wrapping up the 4 primary effectors uh, or that the hypothalamus will signal. You have sweat glands, which will increase your evaporative heat loss, cooling the body. You have your smooth muscle and arterioles, which can cause either dilation or constriction of skin blood flow, depending on if we are heating up or cooling down. You have your skeletal muscles that can shiver to increase heat production. And then you also have your endocrine glands like thyroxine and catecholamines that will elevate metabolic heat. So when we are in heat or in hot, humid environments, the body aims to push heat outward, activating sweat glands, and we see skin blood vessels dilate. And then in the cold, the body protects the core, and so we see vasoconstriction, shivering, and hormonal increases in metabolic rate. And so this is why individuals who live in cold environments will generally have a higher metabolic rate than those who live in warmer environments.